think our world's messed up? Imagine what ancient Rome was like. And yet, Christianity triumphed. For the Colson Center, I'm John Stonestreet. This is Breakpoint. In his book, The Triumph of Christianity, which, by the way, was one of Chuck Colson's favorite books, historian Rodney Stark describes the Roman world of that first Christmas Eve. The gods, Stark writes, were everywhere and thought to be undependable. Apart from some magical powers and perhaps the gift of immortality, there was little to distinguish them from their human worshippers. They ate, drank, loved, envied, fornicated, cheated, lied, and otherwise set morally unedifying examples, he says. And, not surprisingly, they didn't care one bit about those who worshiped them. All they wanted was to be propitiated. In other words, Christ entered into a culture in which the gods of the age were not worthy of worship, and Roman society was just as oppressive and undependable as its gods. For most people, life in the empire cities could be fairly described, to borrow a phrase from philosopher Thomas Hobbes, as nasty, poor, solitary, brutish, and short. Well, this was the world into which Christianity was born. And still Christianity triumphed, not least of which because it offered an alternative to the oppression of Roman society. It offered another way than the dead end of paganism, a way so compelling that it outweighed the obvious social disadvantages of being identified as a Christian. As Stark writes, in the midst of the squalor, misery, illness, and anonymity of ancient cities, Christianity offered an island of mercy and security. Well, I hope that when you hear Stark's words, you realize that we have something far more compelling to offer our contemporaries as well. Many of our contemporaries also worship deities that are undependable and scarcely distinguishable from their worshipers. The Oxford English Dictionary defines worship as the feeling or expression of reverence and adoration for a deity. And worship transforms the worshiper. As Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote, the gods we worship write their names on our faces. Be sure of that. Thus it behooves us to be careful what we worship, for what we are worshiping, we are becoming. Emerson wrote that without even foreseeing the age of social media, in which we increasingly worship what we've become, or at least what we imagine ourselves to be. Many pages on Facebook or Instagram could, with no exaggeration, be called shrines. Our deities are as much of a dead end as the pagan gods of Rome. And like all idol worship, self-worship can be a lonely activity. Just like the Greek gods who didn't play well together, today's pagans are far from anonymous, but just as isolated as their ancient predecessors. A 2011 Cornell study found that the average American only has 2 good friends. And what Christians today have to offer is remarkably similar to what the early Christians had to offer, what Stark called an intense community, a place where, instead of being surrounded by strangers, they're surrounded by brothers and sisters in Christ. A place that when the hard times come, as inevitably they will, there are people who care. There are people who have the distinct responsibility to care. Stated succinctly, what Christians have to offer is a better way of being human than anything that's currently offered in contemporary society. And that's why, despite the often distressing state of our culture, I remain hopeful. The Christian alternative is just as desperately needed today as when the early church offered it to the Romans. And like them, we must proclaim and embody that alternative. If we do, it could be another Christmas Eve all over again. And friends, as we prepare to gather with our own friends and family to exchange gifts and celebrate the light of Christmas coming into the world, please remember Breakpoint and the Colson Center in your year-end giving. Just come to breakpoint.org to give. Thanks so much. And from all of us at the Colson Center, Merry Christmas. For Breakpoint, I'm John Stonestreet.